Chapter 36 of Notwithstanding by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 36. The paths of love are rougher than thoroughfares of stones. Thomas Hardy. Roger lay on his face, with his mouth on the back of his hand. Years and years ago, 20 long years ago, he had once lain on his face as he was doing now. He and Dick had been out shooting with the old keeper, and Dick had shot Roger's dog by mistake. He had taken the catastrophe with a stolid stoicism and a bitten lip. But later in the day he had crept away, and had sobbed for hours, lying on his face under a tree. The remembrance came back to him now. Never since then, never in all those 20 years, had he felt again that same paroxysm of despair. And now again Dick had inadvertently wounded him. Dick, who never meant any harm, had pierced his heart. The wound bled, and Roger bit his hand. Time passed. He did not want to get up any more. If he could have died at that moment, he would have died. He did not want to have anything more to do with this monstrous cheat called life. He did not want ever to see anyone again. He felt broken. The thought that he should presently get to his feet and stump home through the dusk to his empty rooms, as he had done 100 times, filled him with a nausea and rage unspeakable. The mere notion of the passage and the clothes-peg and the umbrella-stand annihilated him. He had reached a place in life where he felt he could not go on. Far in the distance, carried to his ear by the ground, came the muffled thud and beat of a train passing beyond the village, on the other side of the Ribon. He wished dully that he could have put his head on the rails. And the voice to which from a little lad he had never shut his ears, the humdrum, prosaic voice which had bidden him take thought for Mary Dean and her child, and Janey, and Betty Hesketh, and all who were desolate and oppressed, that same small voice, never ignored, never silenced, spoke in Roger's aching, unimaginative heart. The train passed, and as the sound throbbed away into silence, Roger longed again with passion that it had taken his life with it. And the still small voice said, "That is how Annette felt a year ago." He got up and pushed back the damp hair from his forehead. That was how Annette had felt a year ago. Poor, unwise, cruelly treated Annette. Even now, though he had heard her story from her own lips, he could not believe it, could not believe that her life had ever had in it any incident beyond tending her old aunts and watering her flowers and singing in the choir. That was how he had always imagined her, with perhaps a tame canary thrown in, which ate sugar from her lips. If he had watched her with such a small pet, he would have felt it singularly appropriate, a sort of topknot to his ideal of her. If he had seen her alarmed by a squirrel, he would have felt indulgent. If fond of children, tender. If jealous of other women, he should not have been surprised. He had made up a little insipid picture of Annette picking flowers by day and wrapped in maiden slumber in a white room at night. The picture was exactly as he wished her to be, and as her beautiful exterior had assured him she was. For Annette's sweet face told half the men she met that she was their ideal. In nearly every case so far, that ideal had been a masterpiece of commonplace. Though if prizes had been offered for them, Roger would have won easily. Her mind, her character, her individuality had no place in that ideal. That she should have been pushed close up against vice, that she, Annette, who sang "Son of my soul" so beautifully, should have wandered alone in the wicked streets of Paris in the dawn, after escaping out of a home wickeder still, that she should have known treachery, despair, that she should have been stared at as the chance mistress of a disreputable man. Annette! It was incredible. And he had been so careful, at the expense of his love of truth, when they took refuge in Mary Dean's house, that Annette should believe Mary Dean was a married woman and her child born in wedlock. And she, whose ears must not even hear that Mary had been Dick's mistress, she, Annette, had been Dick's mistress too, if not in reality, at any rate in appearance. Roger's brain reeled. He had forgotten the will. His mind could grasp nothing except the ghastly discrepancy between the smug picture of Annette which he had gradually evolved, and this tragic figure, sinned against, passionate, desperate, dragging its betrayal from one man to another. Had she been Dick's mistress? Was it really possible that she had not? Who could touch pitch and not be defiled? Women always denied their shame. How hotly Mary Dean had denied hers only a few months before the birth of her child! Roger reddened at the thought that he was classing Annette, his beautiful lady, with Mary. Oh, where was the real truth? Who could tell him? Whom could he trust? Janey! He said the word aloud with a cry, and Janey's small brown face rose before him as he had known it all his life, since they had been children together, she the little adoring girl, and he the big condescending schoolboy. Janey's crystal truthfulness, her faithfulness, her lifelong devotion to him, became evident to him. He had always taken them for granted, known where to put his hand on them, used them without seeing them, like his old waterproof which he could lay hold of on its peg in the dark. She had always been in the background of his life, like the Ribon and the low hill behind it against the grey sky, which he did not notice when they were there, but from which he could not long absent himself without a sense of loss. And Janey had no past. He knew everything about her. He must go to her now, at once. He did not know exactly what he wanted to say to her, but he groped for his stick, found it, noticed that the dew was heavy and that there would be no rain after all, and set off down the invisible track in the direction of the village, winking its low lights among the trees. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Notwithstanding by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 37. Happiness is inextricably interwoven with loyalty, love, unselfishness, the charity that never fails. In early life we believe that it is just these qualities in those we love that make our happiness, just the lack of them that entail our misery. But later on we find that this is not so. Later on we find that it is our own loyalty, our own love and charity in which our happiness abides, as the soul abides in the body. So we discover at last that happiness is within the reach of all of us, the inalienable birthright of all of us, and that if by misadventure we have mislaid it in our youth, we know where to seek it in after years. For happiness is mislaid, but never lost. M.N. Janey had the doubtful advantage over other women that men, by men I mean Roger, always knew where to find her. She was as immovable as the church or the Ribon. It was absolutely certain that unless Lady Louisa was worse, Janey would come down to the library at 9 o'clock and work there beside the lamp for an hour before going to bed. The element of surprise or uncertainty did not exist as far as Janey was concerned. And perhaps those who are always accessible, tranquil, disengaged, ready to lend a patient and sympathetic ear, know instinctively that they will be sought out in sorrow and anxiety rather than in joy. We do not engage a trained nurse for picnic parties, or ask her to grace the box seat when we are driving our four-in-hands. Annette is singled out at once as appropriate to these festive occasions. If anyone thought of Janey in connection with them, it was only to remark that she would not care about them. How many innocent pleasures she had silently wished for in her time, which she had been informed by her mother, by Dick, even by Roger, were not in her line. Tonight Janey deviated by a hairbreadth from her usual routine. She came down, seated herself, and instead of her work took up a book with the marker halfway through it, and was at once absorbed in it. She was reading The Magnet for the second time. Since her conversation with Mr. Sterling in the Halver garden, Janey had read The Magnet, and her indifference had been replaced by a riveted attention. She saw now what other people saw in his work, and it seemed to her, as indeed it seemed to all Mr. Sterling's readers, that his books were addressed to her and her alone. It did not occur to her that he had lived for several years in her neighbourhood without her detecting or even attempting to discern what he was. It did not occur to her that he might have been a great asset in her narrow life. She was quite content with being slightly acquainted with everyone except Roger and her new friend Annette. She tacitly distrusted intimacy, as did Roger, and though circumstances had brought about a certain intimacy with Annette, the only girl within 5 miles, she had always mental reservations even with her, boundaries which were not to be passed. Janey had been inclined to take shelter behind these mental reservations, to raise still higher the boundary walls between them, since she had known what she called the truth about Annette. She had shrunk from further intercourse with her, but Annette had sought her out, deliberately, persistently, with an unshaken confidence in Janey's affection, which the latter had not the heart to repel. And in the end Janey had reached a kind of forlorn gratitude towards Annette. Her life had become absolutely empty. The future stretched in front of her like some flat, dusty high-road, along which she must toil with aching feet till she dropped. She instinctively turned to Annette, and then shrank from her. She would have shrunk from her altogether, if she had known that it was by Roger's suggestion that Annette made so little opportunities of meeting. Annette had been to see her the day before she went to Noyes, and had found her reading the Magnet, and they had had a long conversation about it. And now, in Janey's second reading, not skipping one word, and going over the more difficult passages twice, she came again upon the sentence which they had discussed. She read it slowly. "The publican and the harlot will go into the kingdom before us, because it is easier for them to flee with loathing from the sins of the flesh, and to press through the strait gate of humility, than it is for us to loathe and flee the sins of the spirit, egotism, pride, resentment, cruelty, insincerity." Janey laid down the book. When Annette had read that sentence aloud to her, Janey had said, "I don't understand that. I think he's wrong. Pride and the other things and insincerity aren't nearly as bad as immorality." "He doesn't say one is worse than the others," Annette had replied, and her quiet eyes had met Janey's bent searchingly upon her. "He only says egotism and the other things make it harder to squeeze through the little gate. You see, they make it impossible for us even to see it, the strait gate." "He writes as if egotism were worse than immorality, as if immorality didn't matter," said Janey stubbornly. How could Annette speak so coolly, so impersonally, as if she had never deviated from the rigid code of morals in which Janey had been brought up? She felt impelled to show her that she, at any rate, held sterner views. Annette cogitated. "Perhaps, Janey, he's learnt that nothing makes getting near the gate so difficult as egotism. He says somewhere else that egotism makes false, mean, dreadful things ready to pounce on us. He's right in the order he puts them in, isn't he? Selfishness first, and then pride. Our pride gets wounded, and then resentment follows. And resentment always wants to inflict pain. That is why he puts cruelty next." "How do you know all this?" said Janey incredulously. "I know about pride and resentment," said Annette, "because I gave way to them once. I think I shall never again." "I don't see why he puts insincerity last." "Perhaps he thinks that it is the worst thing that can happen to us." "To be insincere?" said Janey, amazed. "Yes, I certainly never have met a selfish person who was sincere, have you? They have to be given noble reasons for their selfish actions, so as to keep their self-respect and make us think well of them. I knew a man once, he was a great musician, who was like that. He wanted admiration dreadfully, he craved for it, yet he didn't want to take any trouble to be the things that made one admire people. It ended in— What did it end in? Where insincere people always do end, I think, in a kind of treachery. Perhaps that is why Mr. Sterling puts insincerity last, because insincere people do such dreadful things without knowing they are dreadful. Now, the harlots and the publicans do know. They have the pull of us there." Janey's clear, retentive mind recalled every word of that conversation, the last she had had with Annette, which had left an impression on her mind that Annette had belittled the frailties of the flesh. Why had she done that? Because she had not been guiltless of them herself. In such manner do some of us reason, and find confirmation of that which we suspect. Not that Janey suspected her of stepping aside. She was convinced that she had done so. The evidence had been conclusive. At least, she did not doubt it when Annette was absent. When she was present with her, she knew not how to believe it. It was incredible. Yet it was so. She always came back to that. But why did she and Mr. Sterling both put insincerity as the worst of the spiritual sins? Janie was an inexorable reader, now that she had begun. She ruminated with her small hands folded on the open page. And her honest mind showed her that once, not long ago, she had nearly been insincere herself, when she had told herself with vehemence that it was her bounden duty to Roger to warn him against Annette. What an ugly act of treachery she had almost committed, would have committed, if Mr. Sterling had not come to her aid. She shuddered. Yes, he was right. Insincerity was the place where all meannesses and disloyalties and treacheries lurked, and had their dens like evil beasts, ready to pounce out and destroy the wayfaring spirit wandering on forbidden ground. And she thought of Nurse's treachery for the sake of a livelihood with a new compassion. It was less culpable than that what she had nearly been guilty of herself. And she thought yet again of Annette. She might have done wrong, but you could not look at her and think she could be mean, take refuge in subterfuge or deceit. She would never lie about it to herself or others, Janie said to herself. And she who had lied to herself, though only for a moment, was humbled. She was half expecting Roger, in spite of their conference of this morning, for she knew that he was to see the lawyer about probate that afternoon, and the lawyer might have given an opinion as to the legality of Harry's marriage. Presently she heard his step in the hall, and he came in. She had known Roger all her life, but his whole aspect was unfamiliar to her. As she looked at him, bewildered, she realized that she had never seen him strongly moved before, never in all these years until now. There is something almost terrifying in the emotion of unemotional people. The momentary confidence of the morning, the one tear wrung out of him by perceiving his hope of marriage suddenly wiped out, was as nothing to this. He sat down opposite to her with chalk-white face and reddened, unseeing eyes, and without any preamble recounted to her the story that Annette had told him a few hours before. "She wished you to know it," he said. An immense thankfulness flooded Janie's heart as she listened. It was as if some tense nerve in her brain relaxed. He did know at last, and she, Janie, had not told him. He had heard no word from her. Annette had confessed to him herself, as Mr. Sterling had said she would. She had done what was right, but how difficult. A secret grudge against Annette, which had long lurked at the back of Janie's mind, was exercised, and she gave a sigh of relief. At last he was silent. "I have known for a long time that Annette was the woman who was with Dick at Fontainebleau," she said, her hand still folded on the open book. "You might have told me, Janie." "I thought it ought to come from her." "You might have told me when you saw. Janie, you must have seen for some time past how it was with me." "I did see, but I hoped against hope that she would tell you herself, as she has done." "And if she hadn't, would you have let me marry her, not knowing?" Janie reflected. "I am not sure," she said composedly, "what I should have done. But you see it did not happen so. She has told you. I am thankful she has, Roger, though it must have been hard for her. It is the only thing I have ever kept back from you. It is a great weight off my mind that you know. Only I am ashamed now that I ever doubted her. I did doubt her. I begun to think she would never say." "She's the last person in the world, the very last that I should have thought possible." He could not finish his sentence, and Janie and he looked fixedly at each other. "Yes," she said slowly, "she is. I never get any nearer understanding how anyone like Annette could have done it." Roger, in his haste with his story, had omitted the evil prologue which had led to the disaster. "She wished you to know everything," he said, and he told her of Annette's treacherous lover and her father's infamy, and her flight from his house in the dawn. "She was driven to desperation," said Janie. "When she met Dick, she was in despair. I see it all now. She did not know what she was doing, Roger. Annette has been sinned against. I should like to wring that man's neck who bought her, and her father's who sold her, said Roger, his haggard eyes smouldering. There was a long silence. But I don't feel that I can marry her, he said with a groan. Dick and her, it sticks in my throat. The very thought seems to choke me. I don't feel that I could marry her, even if she would still have me. She said I must forget her and put her out of my life. She feels everything is over between us. It's all very well, savagely, to talk of forgetting anyone like Annette. He beat his foot against the floor. Jenny looked at him in a great compassion. He will come back to me, she said to herself. Not for a long time, but he will come back. Broken and disillusioned and aged, and with only a bit of a heart to give me. He will never care much about me, but I shall be all he has left in the world, and I will take him, whatever he is. She put out her hand for her work, and busied herself with it, knowing instinctively that the occupation of her hands and eyes upon it would fret him less than if she had sat idle and looked at him. She had nothing to learn about how to deal with Roger. She worked for some time in silence, and hope, dead and buried, rose out of his deep grave in her heart and came towards her once more. Was it indeed hope that stirred in its grave, this pallid figure with the shroud still enfolding it, or was it but its ghost? She knew not. At last Roger raised a tortured face out of his hands. "Of course she says she is innocent," he said, looking hopelessly at Janey. Janey started violently. Her work fell from her hands. "Annette says she is innocent," she repeated after him, a flame of colour rushing to her face. "Yes, Mary Dean said the same. They always say it." Janey shook as in an ague. She saw suddenly in front of her a gulf of infamy unspeakable, ready to swallow her if she agreed with him. She who always agreed with him. He would implicitly believe her. The little gleam of hope which had fallen on her aching, mutilated life went out. She was alone in the dark. For a moment she could neither see nor hear. "If Annette says she is innocent, it's true," she said hoarsely, putting her hand to her throat. The room and the lamp became visible again, and Roger's eyes fixed on her like the eyes of a drowning man, wide, dilated, seen through deep water. "If Annette says so, it's true," she repeated. "She may have done wrong. She says she has, but she does not tell lies. You know that." "She says Dick did not try to entrap her, that she went with him of her own accord." "But don't you see that Dick did take advantage of her, all the same, a mean advantage when she was stunned by despair? I don't suppose you have ever known what it is to feel despair, Roger. But I know what it is. I know what Annette felt when her lover failed her." "She told me she meant to drown herself. She said she did not care what became of her." "You don't know what it means to feel like that." Roger heard again the thud and beat of the distant train in the sod against his ear. "Yes, I do," he said, looking at her under his heavy brows. "I don't believe you. If you had, you would understand Annette's momentary madness. She need not have told you that. She need not have blackened herself in your eyes, but she did. Can't you see, Roger? Will you never, never understand that you've had the whole truth from Annette? The most difficult truth in the world to tell. And why do you need me to hammer it into you that she was speaking the truth to you? Can't you see for yourself that Annette is upright as you yourself? What is the good of you if you can't even see that? What is the good of loving her, if you do love her, if you can't see that she doesn't tell lies? I'm not in love with her. There have been times when I've come very near to hating her, and I had reason to believe she had done a wicked action. But I knew one thing, and that was that she would never lie about it. She's not that kind. And if she told you that in a moment of despair she had agreed to do it, but that she had not done it, then she spoke the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." Roger could only stare at Janey, dumbfounded. She, who in his long experience of her had always listened, had spoken so little beyond comment or agreement, now thrust at him with a sword of determined, sharp-edged speech. The only two women he thought he knew were becoming absolute strangers to him. If I had been in Annette's place, I would have died sooner than own that I agreed to do wrong. I should have put the blame on Dick. But Annette is humbler than I am, more loyal than I am, more compassionate. She took the blame herself, which belongs to Dick. She would not speak ill of him. If I had been in her place, I should have hesitated a long time before I told you about the will. It will ruin her good name. I should have thought of that. But she didn't. She thought only of you, only of getting your inheritance for you. Just as when Dick was ill, she only thought of helping him. Go and get your inheritance, Roger. It's yours, and I'm glad it is. You deserve it. But there's one thing you don't deserve, and that is to marry Annette. You're not good enough for her. Janey had risen to her feet. She stood before him, a small, terrible creature with blazing eyes. Then she passed him and left the room, the astounded Roger gaping after her. He waited a long time for her to return, but she did not come back. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Notwithstanding by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 38. Les seuls défauts vraiment terribles sont se comprendre pour des qualités. Être Rabusa. Wherever we go, said Aunt Harriet complacently from her sofa that evening, weddings are sure to follow. I've noticed it again and again. Do you remember, Maria, how when we spent the summer at Nairn, our landlady's son at those nice lodgings married the innkeeper's daughter? And it was very soon after our visit to Riverview that Mary Gray was engaged to the curate. Which reminds me that I am afraid they are very badly off, for I heard from him not long ago that he had resigned his curacy, and that, as his entire trust was in the Almighty, the smallest contribution would be most acceptable. But I did not send anything, because I always thought Mary ought not to have married him. And now we've been here barely 15 months, and here is Harry Manvers marrying the nurse. The Miss Blinkets tell me that she's at least 15 years older than him. Not that that matters at all, if there is spiritual affinity, but in this case— Really, Annette, I think your wits must be wool-gathering. You've put sugar in my coffee, and you know as well as possible that I only have a tiny lump, not in the cup, but in the spoon. Annette expressed her contrition, and poured out another cup. "Did Roger Mandeville say anything to you about Harry's marriage, Annette?" said Aunt Maria. "I thought possibly he had come to consult us about it, but of course he said nothing before the Miss Blinkets. They drove him away. I shall tell Hodgkins we are not at home to them in the future." "He just mentioned the marriage, and that he had been seeing a lawyer about it." "If everyone was as laconic as you are, my love," said Aunt Harriet with some asperity, "conversation would cease to exist. And as to saying 'not at home' to the Miss Blinkets in future, Maria, you will of course do exactly as you please, but I must own that I think it is a mistake to cut ourselves entirely adrift from the life of the neighbourhood at a crisis like this. Will the marriage be recognised? Or ought we to send a present? Shall we be expected to call on her? We shall have to arrive at some decision on these subjects, I presume, and how are we to do so if we close our ears to all sources of information I'm sure I don't know?" "Mayn't we have another chapter of The Silver Cross?" said Annette, in the somewhat strained silence that followed. Aunt Maria was correcting her proof-sheets, and was in the habit of reading them aloud in the evenings. "Yes, do read, Maria," said Aunt Harriet, who, however trying her other characteristics might be, possessed a perennial fund of enthusiastic admiration for her sister's novels. "I could hardly sleep last night for thinking of Blanche's estrangement from Frederick, and of her folly in allowing herself to be drawn into Lord Sprofligate's supper party by that foolish Lady Bonner. Frederick would be sure to hear of it." "I'm afraid," said Aunt Maria with conscious pride, "that the next chapter is hardly one for Annette. It deals, not without a touch of realism, with subjects which, as a delineator of life, I cannot ignore, but which, thank God, have no place in a young girl's existence." "Oh, Maria, how I disagree with you!" interposed Aunt Harriet before Annette could speak. If only I had been warned when I was a young, innocent, high-spirited creature. If only I had been aware of the pitfalls, the snares, spread like nets round the feet of the young and attractive, I should have been spared some terrible disillusionments. I'm afraid I'm far too modern to wish to keep girls in the total ignorance in which our dear mother brought us up. We must march with the times. There's nothing that you, being what you are, Maria, nothing that you with your high ideals could write which, however painful, it could harm Annette to hear. This was perhaps even truer than the Annunciator was aware. She must sometime learn that evil exists, that sin and suffering are all part of life. Annette looked from the excited figure on the sofa to the dignified personage in the armchair, and her heart was wrung for them both. Oh, poor dears, poor dears! Living in this shadowy world of their own in which reality never set foot, this tiny world of which Aunt Harriet spoke so glibly, which Aunt Maria described with such touching confidence. Was she going to shatter it for them? She, whom they were doing their best to guide into it, to make like themselves? "I'm rather tired," she said, folding up her work. "I think I will go to bed, and then you can read the chapter together, and decide whether I can hear it later on." "It is very carefully treated, very lightly, I may say skilfully touched," said Aunt Maria urbanely, whose previous remark had been entirely conventional, and who had no intention of losing half her audience. "I think on the whole I will risk it. Sit down again, Annette. Let me see, how old are you?" 23. Many women at that age are wives and mothers. I agree with you, Harriet. The danger we elders fall into is the want of realization that the younger generation are grown up. We must not make this mistake with you, Annette, or treat you as a child any longer, but as one of ourselves. It is better that you should be made aware of the existence of the seamy side of life, so that later on, if you come in contact with it, your mind may be prepared. Chapter 125. The False Position. End of Chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Notwithstanding by Mary Chumley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 39. All other joy of life he strove to warm, and magnify, and catch them to his lip. But they had suffered shipwreck with the ship, and gazed upon him sallow from the storm. George Meredith. Roger went to Fontainebleau. He looked at the oaks as they came close up on both sides of the line, and thought that they needed thinning, and made a mental note of the inefficiency of French forestry. And he put up at an old-fashioned inn, with a prim garden in front, with tiny pebbled walks, and a fountain, and 4 stunted clipped acacia trees. And he found the doctor in the course of the next morning, and the doctor, who had not realized Dick's death under another name, gave him the notary's address. And the notary explained by means of an interpreter that Monsieur Leguette had warned him emphatically not to give up the will to his mother if she came for it, or send for it after his death. Only to Monsieur Roger Manvers, his cousin, or Mademoiselle Manvers, his sister. And when Roger had presented his card, and the credentials with which his English lawyer had supplied him, the will was produced. The notary opened it, and showed him Dick's signature, almost illegible, but still Dick's, and below the doctor's and his own, and at the bottom of the sheet the 2 words, Annette Georges, in Annette's large childish handwriting. Roger's heart contracted, and for a moment he could see nothing but those 2 words. And the notary explained that the lady's signature had not been necessary, but she had witnessed it to pacify the dying man. Then Roger sat down, with a loudly hammering heart, and read the will slowly, translated to him sentence by sentence. It gave him everything. Halver and Welmsley and Swale and Scorby, and the Yorkshire and Scotch properties, and the street in the heart of Liverpool, and the New River share. There was an annuity of 500 a year out of the estate, and the house at Aldborough to Harry, and the same sum to Mary Dean for life, and then in trust to her daughter, together with a farm in Devonshire. But except for these bequests, everything was left to Roger. Dick had forgotten Jones, his faithful servant, and he had forgotten also that he had parted with his New River share the year before to meet with his colossal losses on the day, still talked of in racing circles, when Flamingo ran out of the course. And the street in Liverpool, that gold mine, was mortgaged up to the hilt. But still, in spite of all, it was a fine inheritance. Roger's heart beat. He'd been a penniless man all his life, and all his life he had served another's will, another's caprice, another's heedlessness. Now, at last, he was his own master. And Halvor, his old home, Halvor which he loved with passion as his uncle and his grandfather had loved it before him, Halvor was his. Mechanically he turned the page and looked at the last words of the will upon it, and poor Dick's scrawl, and the signature of the witnesses. And all the joy ebbed out of his heart as quickly as it had rushed in, as he saw again the two words, Annette Georges. He did not sleep that night. He lay in a bed which held no rest for him, and a nameless oppression fell upon him. He was overtired, and he had suffered severely mentally during the past week, and it seemed as if the room itself exercised some sinister influence over him. Surely the mustard-coloured roses of the wallpaper knew too much. Surely the tall gilt mirror had reflected and then wiped from its surface scenes of anguish and despair. Roger sat up in bed, and saw himself a dim figure with a shock head reflected in it. The moonlight lay in a narrow band upon the floor. The blind tapped against the window ledge. Was that a woman's white figure crouching near the window, with bent head against the pane? It was only the moonlight upon the curtain, together with the shadow of the tree outside. Roger got up and fastened the blind so that the tapping ceased, and then went back to bed again. But sleep would not come. He had read over the translation of the will several times. It, and the will itself, were locked into the little bag under his pillow. His hand touched it from time to time. And as the moonlight travelled across the floor, Roger's thoughts travelled also. His slow, honest mind never could be hurried, as those who did business with him were well aware. It never rushed, even to an obvious conclusion. It walked. If urged forward, it at once stood stock still. But if it moved slowly of its own accord, it also evaded nothing. Then Dick must have distrusted his mother just as Janey had done. Roger had been shocked by Janey's lack of filial piety, but he at once concluded that Dick must have had grounds for his distrust. It did not strike him that Janey and Dick might have had the same grounds, that some sinister incident locked away in their childish memories had perhaps warned them of the possibility of a great treachery. No doubt Janey was not mentioned in Dick's will, because it had always been understood that Noyes would go to her. Lady Louisa had given out that she had so left it years before. That was what was in the old woman's mind, no doubt, Roger said to himself, to let Janey have Noyes and get Halvor and the rest for Harry, if possible, even if she had to destroy Dick's will in my favour. She never took it into her calculation, poor thing, that by the time Dick died she might as be incapable of making another will as he was himself. Seems as if paralysis was in the family. If she knew I got Halvor after all, she'd cut Janey out of Noyes like a shot if she could, and leave it to Harry. But she can't, and Harry will do very nicely in that little house at Aldborough with 500 a year, play on the beach, make a collection of shells and an aquarium, sea anemones and shrimps, and his wife can take charge of him, relieve poor Janey. I shall put in a new bathroom at Seaview, and I shall furnish it for him. Some of the things Mary Dean would do. He would like those great gilt mirrors, and the sporting prints, and she'd like the walnut suite. That marriage may not be such a bad thing after all. Hope poor Aunt Louisa won't understand anything about it, or my coming in for Halvor. It would make her perfectly mad. Might kill her. But perhaps that wouldn't be such a very bad thing either. Silver lining to cloud, perhaps, and give Janey a chance of a little peace. Roger's mind travelled slowly over his inheritance, and verified piece by piece that it was a very good one. In spite of Dick's recklessness, much still remained. The new river share was gone. Dick had got over 100,000 for it, but it had been worth more. And the house in Eaton Square was gone, and Princes Street was as good as gone. He should probably be wise to let the mortgagers foreclose on it. But Halvor remained intact, save for the loss of the Rayburn and the Oak Avenue. How cracked of Dick to have sold the Rayburn and cut down the Oak Avenue, when, if he had only consulted him, Roger could have raised the money by a mortgage on Welmsley. But he ought not to be blaming Dick after what he had done for him. On the contrary, he ought to put up a good monument to him in Riff Church. And he certainly would do so. Halvor was his. Halvor was his. Now at last he had a free hand. Now at last he could do his duty by the property, unhampered by constant refusals to be allowed to spend money where it ought to be spent. He should be able to meet all his farmers on a better footing now. No need to put off their demands from year to year, and lose the best among them because he could not meet even their most reasonable claims. He could put an entire new roof on Scorby Farm now, instead of tinkering at it, and he would pull down those wretched ferry cottages and rebuild them on higher ground. He knew exactly where he would put them. It was a crying shame that it had not been done years ago. And he would drain Menham Marsh, and then the Menham people would not have agues and goiters. And he should make a high paved way across the water meadows to Walesham, so that the children could get to school dry-shod. He could hardly believe that at last he was his own master. No more inditing of those painfully constructed letters which his sense of duty had made incumbent on him, letters which it had taken him so long to write, and which were probably never read. Dick had never attended to business. If people could not attend to business, Roger wondered what they could attend to. And he would make it right about Jones. Jones need never know his master had forgotten him. Roger would give him an annuity of 100 a year, and tell him it was by Dick's wish. Dick certainly would have wished it if he had thought of it. Roger gave a sigh of relief at the thought of Jones. And he should pension off old Toby and Hesketh and Noix. They had worked on the estate for over 40 years. Roger settled quantities of detail in numberless little mental pigeonholes as the moonlight travelled across the floor. All through the day and the long evening, whenever he had thought of Annette, his mind had stood stock still and refused to move. And now, at last, as if it had waited till this silent hour, the thought of Annette came to him again, and this time would not be denied. Once more his resisting mind winced and stood still. And Roger, who connived at its resistance, forced it, slowly, reluctantly, to do his bidding. He could marry Annette now. Strange how little joy that thought evoked. He would have given everything he possessed 2 days ago, not that he possessed anything, to have been able to make her his wife. If 2 days ago he had been told that he would inherit Halvor and be able to marry her, his cup would have been full. Well, now he could have her if she would take him. He was ashamed, but not as much as he ought to have been, of his momentary doubt of her. Fortunately, only Janey knew of that doubt. Annette would never know that he had hesitated. Now that he came to think of it, she had gone away from him so quickly that he had not had time to say a word. Roger sighed heavily. He knew in his heart that he had not quite trusted Annette when he ought to have done. But he did not absolutely trust Janey. And Janey had said Annette was innocent. He need not cudgel his brains as to whether he would still have wanted to marry her if she had been Dick's mistress, because she never had been. That was settled. Annette was as pure as Janey herself, and he ought to have known it without Janey having to tell him. Roger turned uneasily on his bed, and then took the goad which only honest men possess, and applied it to his mind. It winced and shrank back, and then, seeing no help for it, made a step forward. Annette had given him his inheritance. He faced that at last. She had got the will made. But for her, Dick would have died intestate. And but for her, it was doubtful whether the will would ever have come to light. Neither the notary nor the doctor had at first connected the death of Mr. Manvers with that of Dick Leggett, even when Roger showed them the notice in the papers which he had brought with him. Annette had done everything for him. Well, he would do everything for her. He would marry her and be good to her all his life. Yes, but would she care to marry a man who could only arrive at his inheritance by smirching her good name? The will could not be proved without doing that. What wicked folly of Dick to have asked her, poor child, to witness it! And how exasperatingly like him! He never considered the result of any action. The slur on Annette's reputation would be publicly known. The doctor and the notary who had told him of Annette's relation to Dick could but confirm it. No denial from them was possible. And sooner or later the ugly scandal would be known by every creature at Riff. Roger choked. Now he realized that, was he still willing to marry her? He was willing. He was more than willing. He was absolutely determined. He wanted her as he had never wanted anything in his life. He would marry her, and together they would face the scandal and live it down. Janey would stick to them. He loathed the thought of the whispering tongues destroying his wife's good name. He sickened at it, but it was inevitable. But would Annette on her side be willing to marry him and bear the obloquy that must fall upon her? Would she not prefer to leave Riff and him forever? That was what he must ask her. In his heart he believed she would still take him. She would bear it for my sake, he said to himself. Annette is very brave, and she thinks nothing of herself. A faint glimmer of her character was beginning to dawn in her lover's shaken mind. The son of my soul, tame canary, fancy portrait of his own composition, on which he had often fondly dwelt, did not prove much of a mainstay at this crisis, perhaps because it lacked life. Who can lean upon a wooden heart? It is sad that some of us never perceive the nobility of those we love until we need it. Roger had urgent need of Annette's generosity and unselfishness, urgent need of her humility. He unconsciously wanted all the greatest qualities of her heart and mind from her, he who had been drawn towards her, as Janey well knew, only by little things, by her sweet face and her violet eyes, and the curl on her white neck. After all, would it be best for her that they should part? Something in Roger cried out in such mortal terror of its life that that thought was dismissed as unendurable. "We can't part," said Roger to himself. "The truth is, I can't live without her, and I won't. We'll face it together." But there was anguish in the thought. His beautiful lady who loved him, that he who held her so dear, who only asked to protect her from pain and ill, that he should be the one to cast a slur upon her. But there was no way out of it. He sobbed against his pillow, and in the silence came the stammered, half-choked words, "Annette, Annette." But only the room heard them, which had heard the same appeal on a September night just a year ago. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Notwithstanding by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 40. Twice I have stood a beggar before the door of God. Emily Dickinson. "I don't find either of you very helpful," said Aunt Harriet plaintively. Her couch had been wheeled out under the apple tree, and her sister and niece were sitting with her under its shade after luncheon. During the meal Aunt Harriet had at considerable length expounded one of the many problems that agitated her, the solution of which would have robbed her of her principal happiness in life. Her mind, what little there was of it, was spasmodically and intermittently employed in what she called threshing out things. The real problems of life never got within shouting distance of Aunt Harriet, but she would argue for days together whether it was right, not for others but for her, to repeat, as if she assented to them, the somewhat unsympathetic utterances of the Athanasian Creed as to the fate in store for those who did not hold its tenets. "And I don't believe they will all go to hell-fire," she said mournfully. "I'm too wide-minded, and I've lived too much in a highly cultivated society. The Miss Blinkets may, but I don't. And I know as a fact that Mr. Harvey does not believe in it either. Though, of course, I do accept the Athanasian Creed. I was able to assure Canon Weatherby so only yesterday when I discussed the subject with him. He said it was the cornerstone of the Church, and that in these agnostic days we Church people must all hold firmly together, shoulder to shoulder. I see that, and I don't want to undermine the Church, but—" "Suppose you were to leave out that one response about hell-fire," said Annette, "and say all the rest." "I'm afraid my silence might be noticed. It was different in London, but in a place like Riff, where we, Maria of course more than I, but still where we both stand, as I may say, in the forefront, take the lead in the religious life of the place, good example, influential attitude, every eye upon us. It is perplexing, for is it quite truthful to keep silence? Dare to be true, nothing can need a lie. How do you meet that, Annette? Or, to thine own self be true, and it will follow as the night to-day? I mean, as the day to-night. Thou canst not then be false to anybody. What do you say to that, Annette? Annette appeared to have nothing to say, and did not answer. Aunt Maria, slowly turning the leaves of a presentation volume from Mr. Harvey, said nothing either. "I don't find either of you particularly helpful," said Aunt Harriet again. "You are both very fortunate, I'm sure, not to have any spiritual difficulties. Often wish I had not such an active mind. I think I'd better ask Mr. Black to come and see me about it. He is always kind. He tells me people constantly unburden themselves to him." "That is an excellent idea," said Aunt Maria promptly, with a total lack of consideration for Mr. Black, who perhaps, however, deserved his fate for putting his lips to his own trumpet. "He studied these subjects more than Annette and I have done. Ask him to luncheon tomorrow." Aunt Harriet, somewhat mollified, settled herself among her cushions, and withdrew her teeth as a preliminary to her daily siesta. Aunt Maria, who had been bolt upright at her desk since 9:30, took off her spectacles and closed her eyes. "Fly, my dear, fly," said Aunt Harriet. "Catch Hodgkins, and tell her that we are not at home. I'm not equal to seeing anybody until 4 o'clock. I shall have thought all the neighbourhood must have realized that by now. Save me, Annette." Annette hurried into the house, and then through a side window suddenly caught sight of Mrs. Stoddart's long, grim face under a parasol, and ran out to her and dragged her out of the carriage. "I thought you had gone," she said, holding her tightly by her mantilla, as if Mrs. Stoddart might elude her even now. The older woman looked at Annette's drawn face and thrust out her underlip. She had feared there would be trouble when Annette told Roger of her past, and had asked Mr. Sterling to let her stay on at Noyes a few days longer. As she sat by Annette in the parlour at Redriff, she saw that trouble had indeed come. "You have told your Roger," she said laconically, looking at the girl with anger and respect. "I don't need to ask how he has taken it." Annette recounted what had happened, and once again Mrs. Stoddart experienced a shock. She had come prepared to hear that Roger had withdrawn the light of his countenance from Annette, and to offer stern consolation. But the complication caused by Annette having informed Roger of the existence of the will, and the fact that she had witnessed it, overwhelmed her. A swift spasm passed over her face. "This is the first I've heard of you witnessing it," she said, sitting very bolt upright on the sofa. Annette owned she had entirely forgotten that she had done so, until Roger had told her no will was forthcoming. "Then it all came back to me," she said. "It's not to be wondered at that you did not remember, considering you became unconscious with brain fever a few hours later," said Mrs. Stoddart, in a perfectly level voice. And then, without any warning, she began to cry. Annette gazed at her, thunderstruck. She had never seen her cry before. What that able woman did, she did thoroughly. "I thought I had seen to everything," she said presently, her voice shaking with anger. "Taken every precaution, stopped up every hole where discovery could leak out, and fortune favoured you. My only fear was that Dick's valet, who was at the funeral, might recognise you, but he didn't." "I told you he did not see me at the station that day I went with Dick." "I know you did, but I thought he might have seen you all the same. But he evidently didn't, or he would have mentioned it to the family at once. And now all my trouble and cleverness and planning for you are thrown away, are made absolutely useless by yourself, Annette, because of your suicidal simpleness in witnessing that accursed will. It's enough to make a saint swear." Mrs. Stoddart wiped her eyes and shook her fist in the air. "Providence never does play fair," she said. "I've been outwitted, beaten, but it wasn't cricket. I keep my self-respect. The question remains, what is to be done?" "I shall wait till Roger comes back before I do anything. I take for granted that Roger Manvers and his cousin Janie will never say a word against you. that they will never tell, as the children say? I'm sure they never will. How much good that will do you when your signature is fixed to Dick's will. That fact must become known, and your position at Fontainebleau is bound to leak out. Roger can't prove the will without giving you away. Do you understand that? I had not thought of it. That every man, woman, and child at Riff, including your aunts, will know about you. Yes. A very faint yes through white lips. And they will all, with one consent, especially your aunts, believe the worst. I'm afraid they will. There was a long silence. You can't remain here, Annette. You said before at Fontainebleau that I could not remain, but I did. Mrs. Stoddart recognized, not for the first time, behind Annette's mildness an obstinacy before which she was powerless. As usual, she tried another tack. For the sake of your aunts, you ought to leave at once, and you ought to persuade them to go with you before the first breath of scandal reaches Riff. Yes, we must all go. Of course we can't go on living here, but I would rather see Roger first. Roger is good, and he is so kind. He will understand about the aunts, and give me a few days to make it as easy to them as it can be made, poor dears. You ought to prepare their minds for leaving Riff. I should not think that would be difficult, for they lamented to me that they were buried here, and only remained on your account. Yes, they will always say that. I will tell them I don't like it, and as they don't like it either, it would be best if we went away. You are wishing that nothing had been kept from them in the first instance? Said Mrs. Stoddart, deeply wounded, though she kept an inflexible face. Yes, said Annette, and yet I have always been thankful in a way they did not know. I felt the last few days as if the only thing I really could not bear was telling the aunts. But this will be even worse. I mean that you say everybody will know. It will wound them in their pride and upset them dreadfully. And they are fond of me now, which will make it worse for them if it is publicly known. They might have got over it if only Roger and Janey knew. But they will never forgive me putting them to public shame. Come and live with me, said Mrs. Stoddart fiercely. I love you, Annette. And in her heart she thought that if her precious only son, her adored Mark, did fall in love with Annette, he could not do better. Come and live with me. I will gladly come and live with you for a time later on. Come now. Not yet. It's no use stopping, she said, taking the girl by the shoulders. What's the good? Your Roger won't marry you, my poor child. No, said Annette firmly, though her lips had blanched. I know he will not, but I ran away before when someone would not marry me, and it did not make things any better, only much, much worse. My mind is made up. I will stay this time. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Notwithstanding by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 41. Il ne suffit pas d'être logique en ce monde. Il faut savoir vivre avec ceux qui ne le sont pas. Vatur. In later years Annette remembered little of the days that passed while Roger was in France. They ought to have been terrible days, days of suspense and foreboding, but they were not. Her mind was at rest. It had long oppressed her that her two best friends, Roger and Janey, were in ignorance of certain facts about her which their friendship for her and their trust in her gave them a right to know. With a sinking of the heart she said to herself, They know now. But that was easier to bear than they ought to know. If she had hoped for a letter from Roger, none came, but I hardly think she was so foolish as to hope it. Janey had been to see her, had climbed up to her little attic, and had stretched out her arms to her, and Annette and she had held each other closely, and looked into each other's eyes, and kissed each other in silence. No words passed between them, and then Janey had gone away again. The remembrance of that wordless embrace lay heavy on Janey's sore heart. Annette, pallid and worn, had blamed no one, had made no excuse for herself. How she had misjudged Annette, she, her friend. But if Annette felt relief about Roger and Janey, The thought of the aunts brought a pang with it, especially since Mrs. Stoddart's visit. They had reached the state of nerves when the sweeps are an event, a broken window cord an occasion for fortitude, a patch of damp on the ceiling a disaster. They would be wounded to the quick in their pride and in their affection if any scandal attached to her name, for they had become fond of her since she had devoted herself to them. While she had been as a young girl a claim on their time and attention, they had not cared much about her, but now she was indispensable to them, and she who formerly could do nothing right could now hardly do anything wrong. Oh, why had she concealed anything from them in the first instance? Why had she allowed kind, clever Mrs. Stoddart to judge for her what was right, when she ought to have followed her instinct of telling them before they had come to lean upon her? Mrs. Stoddart only thought of me, Annette said to herself. She never considered the aunts at all, which was about the truth. Their whole happiness would be destroyed, the even tenor of their lives broken up. Aunt Maria often talked as if she had plumbed the greatest depths to which human nature can sink. Aunt Harriet had more than hinted that many dark and even improper problems had been unravelled in tears beside her couch. But Annette knew very well that these utterances were purely academic, and had no connection with anything real, indicating only the anxious desire of middle age, half conscious that it is in a backwater, to impress on itself and others that, to use its own pathetic phrase, it is keeping in touch with life. The aunts must leave Riff, and quickly. Mrs. Stoddart was right. Annette realized that their lives could be reconstructed like other mechanisms, taken down like an arm building and put up elsewhere. They had struck no root in Riff, as she herself had done. Aunt Harriet had always had a leaning towards Bournemouth. No doubt they could easily form there another little circle where they would be admired and appreciated. There must be the equivalent of Canon Weatherby wherever one went. Yes, they must leave Riff. Fortunately, both aunts had only consented, much against the grain, to live in the country on account of their sister's health. Both lamented that they were cut off from congenial literary society. Both frequently regretted the move. She would have no difficulty in persuading them to leave Riff, for already she had to exercise a certain amount of persuasion to induce them to remain. She must prepare their minds without delay. For once, fortune favoured her. Aunt Harriet did not come down to breakfast, and the meal was, in consequence, one of the pleasantest of the day, in spite of the fact that Aunt Maria was generally oppressed with the thought of the morning's work which was hanging over her. She was unhappy and irritable if she did not work, and pessimistic as to the quality of what she had written if she did work. But Aunt Harriet had a knack of occasionally trailing and untoileted in her dressing-gown without her toupee during breakfast, ostensibly in order to impart interesting items of news culled from her morning letters, but in reality to glean up any small scraps of information in the voluminous correspondence of her sister. She did so the morning after Mrs. Stoddart's visit, carrying in one hand her air-cushion, and with the other holding out a card to Aunt Maria, sitting bolt upright, neatly groomed, self-respecting, behind her silver teapot. "Oh, Maria, see what we miss by living in the country." Aunt Maria adjusted her pince-nez and inspected the card. "Mission to the women of the Zambesi. Oh, oh. The bishop will speak himself," almost wailed Aunt Harriet. "Don't you see it, Maria? We'll address the meeting, our own dear bishop." "If you are alluding to the Bishop of Bullywogga, you never went to the previous meetings of the society when we were in London." "Could I help that?" said Aunt Harriet, much wounded. "Really, you sometimes speak, Maria, as if I had not a weak spine and could move about as I liked. No one was more active than I was before I was struck down, and I suppose it is only natural that I should miss the va-et-vient, the movement, the clash of wits of London. I never have complained. I never do complain, but I'm completely buried here, and that's the truth." "We came here on Catherine's account," said Aunt Maria. "No one regretted the move more than I did. Except Mr. Sterling, there is no one I really care to associate with down here." "Why remain, then," said Annette, "if none of us like it?" Both the aunts stared at her aghast. "Leave Redriff?" said Aunt Maria, as if it had been suggested that she should leave this planet altogether. "Why, Annette," said Aunt Harriet with dignity, Of course we should not think of doing such a selfish thing, now we have you to think of. At least I speak for myself. You love the country. It suits you. You are not intellectual, not like us, passionately absorbed in the problems of the day. You have your little milieu, and your little innocent local interests, the choir, the Sunday school, your friends the Miss Blinkets, the Manvers, the Blacks. It would be too cruel to uproot you now, and I for one should never consent to it. Aren't you happy here, Annette, that you wish to move? Said Aunt Maria dryly. It slid through Annette's mind that she understood why Aunt Maria complained that few of her friends had remained loyal to her. She looked straight in front of her. There was a perceptible pause before she spoke again. I have been happy here, but I should not like Redriff as a permanency. Oh, my dear love, said Aunt Harriet, suddenly lurching from her chair and kneeling down beside Annette, while the little air-cushion ran with unusual vigour into the middle of the room, and then subsided with equal suddenness on the floor. I feared this. I have seen it coming. Men are like that, even the clergy. I may say more especially the clergy. They know not what they do, or what a fragile thing a young girl's heart is. But are you not giving way to despair too early in the day? Don't you agree with Maria? This may be only the night of sorrow. Joy may come in the morning. Annette could not help smiling. She raised her aunt, retrieved the air-cushion, replaced her upon it, and said, You are making a mistake. I am not interested in Mr. Black. I never thought for a moment you were, said Aunt Maria bluntly. Mr. Black is all very well, a most estimable person, I have no doubt, but I don't see why you are in such a hurry to leave Riff. You both want to go, and so do I. As we all three wish to go, why stay? Personally, I am in no hurry to go till I have finished the Silver Cross, said Aunt Maria. No one misses the stimulus of cultivated society more than I do, but I always feel London life with its large demands upon one somewhat of a strain when I am composing, and the seclusion of the country is certainly conducive to work. As for myself, said Aunt Harriet with dignity, I would not willingly place a great distance between myself and dear Cathy's grave. Aunt Maria and Annette winced. And I'm sure I don't know who is wanting to leave Riff if it isn't you, Maria. Haven't I just said that I never do complain? Have I ever complained? And there's no doubt, delicate as I am the better for the country air. Aunt Harriet was subsiding into tears and a handkerchief. See, only 9 miles off, crowflies, fresh cream, new-laid eggs, more colour. Canon Weatherby noticed it. He said, Someone's looking well. And nearly £1 gained since last weighed. And now all this talk about leaving and putting it on me as if it was my suggestion. It was mine, said Annette cheerfully, with the dreadful knowledge which is mercifully only the outcome of affection. I retract it. After all, why should you both leave Riff if you liked living here? Let us each go on our own way and do what suits us best. You must both stay, and I will go. There was a dead silence. The two aunts looked aghast at Annette, and she saw, almost without shame, how entirely she had the whip hand. Their dependence on her was too complete. I don't understand this sudden change on your part, said Aunt Maria at last. Is it only a preamble to the fact that you intend to leave us a second time? Not if you live in London, said Annette firmly, or Bournemouth. But I don't care for the country all the year round, and I would prefer to move before the winter. I'm rather afraid of the effect the snow might have on me. Aunt Harriet looked terrified. I believe it lies very deep, feet deep, all over Loamshire. Mrs. Stoddart asked me to winter with her in London, so perhaps I'd better write and tell her I will do so. And now I must go and order dinner. She got up and left the room, leaving her two aunts staring as blankly at each other as after their sister's funeral. Maria, said Aunt Harriet in a hollow voice, we have no knowledge of the effect of wide areas of snow upon our constitution. And so that was what Mrs. Stoddart came over about yesterday, said Aunt Maria. She wants to get Annette away from us, and make her act as unpaid companion to her. I must say it is fairly barefaced. Annette's place is with us until she marries, and if it is necessary I shall inform Mrs. Stoddart of that fact. At the same time, I've had it in my mind for some time past that it might be advisable to shut up this house for the winter months and take one in London. End of Chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Notwithstanding by Mary Cholmondeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 42. There are seasons in human affairs when qualities, fit enough to conduct the common business of life, are feeble and useless, when men must trust to emotion for that safety which reason at such times can never give. Sidney Smith. Annette had been waked early by two young swallows which had flown into her room and had circled swiftly round it with sharp, ecstatic cries, and then had sped out again into the dawn. She dressed, and went noiselessly into the garden, and then wandered into the long meadows that stretched in front of the house. The low, slanting sunshine was piercing the mist, which moved slowly along the ground, and curled up into the windless air like smoke. The dew was on everything. She wondered the blades of grass could each bear such a burden of it. Every spider's web in the hedgerow, and what numbers there seemed, all of a sudden had become a glistening, silver-beaded pocket. Surely no fly, however heedless, would fly therein. And everywhere the yellow tips of the groundsel had expanded into tiny white fluffy balls of down, strewing the empty fields, floating with the floating mist. But though it was early, the little world of Riff was astir. In the distance she could hear the throb of the mill, and close at hand across the lane 2 great yellow horses were solemnly pacing an empty clover field, accompanied by much jingling of machinery and a boyish whistle. Men with long rakes were drawing the weeds into heaps, and wreaths of smoke mingled with the mist. The thin fires leaped and crackled, the pale flames hardly wavering in the still, sunny air. Instinctively Annette's steps turned towards the sound of the mill. She crossed the ford by the white stepping-stones, dislodging a colony of ducks preening themselves upon the biggest stone, and followed the willow-edged stream to the mill. There had been rain in the night, and the little Riband chafed and girded against the mill-race. She watched it, as a year ago she had watched the Seine chafe against its great stone bastions. The past rose before her at the sight and sound of the water, and the crinkling and circling of the eddies of yellow foam. How unendurable her life had seemed to her on that day. And now today, life was valueless. Once again it had been shattered like glass. She had been cast forth then. Now she was cast forth once more. She had made herself a little niche, crept into a crevice where she had thought no angel with a flaming sword would find her and drive her out. But she was being driven out once more into the wilderness. She had no abiding city anywhere. From where she stood she looked past the mill to the released and pacified water circling round the village, and then stretching away, silver band beyond silver band, in the direction of Riband Bridge. The sun had vanquished the mist, and lay warmly on the clustered cottages and the grey church tower, and on the old red and blue facade of Halva among its hollies. And very high up above it all stretched a sky of tiny shredded clouds like a flock of 1,000,000 sheep. How tranquil it all was, and how closely akin to her, how fraught with mysterious meaning. As the kind meadows and trees ever do seem fraught where we have met love, even the love that is unequal and presently passes away. She must leave it all, and she must part with Roger. She had thought of him as her husband. She had thought of the children she should bear him. She looked at the water with eyes as tearless as a year ago, and saw her happiness pass like a bubble on its surface, break like the iridescent bubble that it is on life's rough river. But the water held no temptation for her today. She had passed the place where we are intolerant of burdens. She saw that they are the common lot. Roger and Janey had borne theirs in patience and in silence and without self-pity for years. They were her ideal, and she must try to be like them. She did not need her solemn promise to Dick to keep her from the water's edge, though her sense of desolation was greater today than it had been a year ago. For there had been pride and resentment in her heart then, and it is not a wounded devotion, but a wounded self-love which arouses resentment in our hearts. She felt no anger today, no bitter sense of humiliation, but her heart ached for Roger. Something in her needed him, needed him. There was no romance now, as she had once known it, no field of lilies under a new moon. Her love for Roger had gone deeper, where all love must go, if it is to survive its rainbow youth. She had thought she had found an abiding city in Roger's heart, but he had let her leave him without a word after her confession. He had not called her back. He had not written to her since. "I am not good enough for him," said Annette to herself. "That is the truth. He and Janey are too far above me." She longed for a moment that the position might have been reversed, that it might have been she who was too good for Roger. Only it was unthinkable. But if he had been under some cloud, then she knew that they would not have had to part. She reached the stile where the water meadows begin, and instinctively she stood still and looked at her little world once more, and thankfulness flooded her heart. After all, Roger had come in for his inheritance, for this place which he loved so stubbornly. She was not what he thought, but if she had been, if she had never had a mired moment, if she had never gone to Fontainebleau, it was almost certain Dick would never have made his will. She had at any rate done that for Roger. Out of evil good had come, if not to her, to him. She crossed the stile where the river bent away from the path, and then came back to it, slow and peaceful once more, whispering amid its reeds, the flurry of the mill race all forgotten. Would she one day, when she was very old, would she also forget? Across the empty field thin smoke wreaths came drifting. Here too they had been burning the weeds. At her feet, at the water's edge, blue eyes of forget-me-nots peered suddenly at her. It had no right to be in flower now. She stooped over the low bank, holding by a twisted willow branch, and reached it and put it in her bosom. And as she looked at it, it seemed to Annette that in some forgotten past she had wandered in a great peace by a stream such as this, a kind, understanding stream, and she had gathered a spray of forget-me-not such as this, and had put it in her bosom, and she had met beside the stream one that loved her, and all had been well, exceeding well. A great peace enfolded her, as a mother enfolds her new-born babe. She was wrapped away from pain. Along the narrow path by the water's edge, Roger was coming, now dimly seen through the curling smoke, now visible in the sunshine. Annette felt no surprise at seeing him. She had not heard of his return, but she knew now that she had been waiting for him. He came up to her, and then stopped. Neither held out a hand, as they looked gravely at each other. Then he explained something about having missed the last train from Ipswich, and how he had slept there, and had come out to Ryburn Bridge by the first train this morning. "I have the will," he said, and touched his breast. And his eyes passed beyond her to the familiar picture he knew so well, of Riff beyond the river, and the low church tower, and the old house among the trees. He looked long at it all, and Annette saw that his inheritance was his first thought. It seemed to her natural. There were many, many women in the world, but only one Halvor. His honest, tired face quivered. "I owe it to you," he said. She did not answer. She turned with him, and they went a few steps in silence, and if she had not been rapt away from all pain, I think she must have been wounded by his choosing that moment to tell her that the notary had pronounced Halvor hiver, and that those French lawyers were a very ignorant lot. But he was, in reality, only getting ready to say something, and it was his habit to say something else while doing so. He had no fear of being banal. It was a word he had never heard. He informed her which hotel he had put up at in Ipswich, and how he had had a couple of poached eggs on arrival. Then he stopped. "Annette," he said, "of course you understand about my not writing to you, because I ought to have written." Annette said faintly, as all women must say, that she had understood. No doubt she had, but not in the sense which he imagined. "I owe it all to you," he said again, But I shouldn't have any happiness in it unless I had you too. Annette, will you marry me?" She shook her head. But there would be no marriages at all if men took any notice of such bagatelles as that. Roger pressed stolidly forward. "I had not time to say anything the other day," he said, hurrying over what even he realized was thin ice. "You were gone all in a flash, but Annette, nothing you said then makes any change in my feeling for you. I wanted to marry you before, and I want to marry you now." "Didn't they, the doctor and the notary, didn't they tell you when you saw my signature that I was guilty?" "Yes," said Roger firmly, "they did. The doctor spoke of you with great respect, but he did think so. But you have told me you were not. That is enough for me. Will you marry me, Annette?" "You are good, Roger," she said, looking at him with a great tenderness. "Good all through. That is why you think I am good too. But the will remains. My signature to it remains. That must be known when the will is proved. Mrs. Stoddart says so. She said my good name must suffer. I'm afraid, if I married you, that you and Janey would be the only two people in Riff who would believe that I was innocent." "And is not my belief enough?" She looked at him with love unspeakable. "It is enough for me," she said, "but not for you. You would not be happy, or only for a little bit, not for long, with a wife whom everyone from the bishop to the cowman, believed to be Dick's cast-off mistress." Roger set his teeth and became his usual plum colour. "We would live it down." "No," she said. "That is the kind of thing that is never lived down, at least not in places like this. I know enough to know that." He knew it too. He knew it better than she did. He got the will slowly out of his pocket and opened it. They looked together at her signature. Roger saw it through tears of rage and crushed the paper together again into his pocket. "Oh, Annette," he said with a groan, "why did you sign it?" "I did it to please Dick," she said. Across the water the church bell called to an early service. Roger looked once more at his little world, grown shadowy and indistinct in a veil of smoke. It seemed as if his happiness were fading and eddying away into thin air with the eddies of blue smoke. "We must part," said Annette. "I'm sure you see that." The forget-me-not fell from her bosom, and she let it lie. He looked back at her. He had become very pale. "I see one thing," he said fiercely, "and that is that I can't live without you, and what is more, I don't mean to. If you will marry me, I'll stand the racket about the scandal. Halvor is no good to me without you. My life is no good to me without you. If you won't marry me, I'll marry no one, so help me God. If you won't take me, I shall never have any happiness at all. So now you know, with your talk of parting." She did not answer. She stooped and picked up the forget-me-not again and put it back in her bosom. Perhaps she thought that was an answer. "Annette," he said slowly, "do you care for me enough to marry me and live here with me? You as my wife and Halvor as my home are the two things I want. But that is all very well for me. The scandal will fall worst on you. If I can stand it, can you?" "Yes." "It will come very hard on you, Annette." "I don't mind." "I shan't be able to shield you from evil tongues. There's not a soul in the village that won't end by knowing, sooner or later. And they think all the world of you now. Can you bear all this? For my sake?" "Yes." "And yet you're crying, Annette." "I was thinking about the aunts. They will feel it so dreadfully, and so will Mrs. Nichols. I'm very fond of Mrs. Nichols." He caught her to him and kissed her passionately. "Do you never think of yourself?" he stammered. "You chucked your name away to please poor Dick, and you're ready to marry me and brave it out to please me?" "You are enough for me, Roger." She clung to him. He trembled exceedingly and wrenched himself away from her. "Am I? Am I enough? A man who will put you through such a thing, even if you're willing, Annette? You stick at nothing. You're willing, but, by God, I'm not." She looked dumbly at him with anguish in her violet eyes. She thought he was going to discard her after all. "I thought I wanted Halvor more than anything in the world," he said wildly, tearing the will out of his pocket. "But the price is too high. My wife's good name. I won't pay it, Annette. I will not pay it." And he strode to the nearest bonfire and flung the will into it. The smoke eddied and blew suddenly towards them. The fire hesitated a moment, and then, as Annette gazed, stupefied, a little flame curled busily along the open sheet. Before he knew she had moved, she had rushed past him and had thrust her hands into the fire and torn out the burning paper. The flame ran nimbly up her arm, devouring her thin sleeve, and he had only just time to beat it out with his hands before it reached her hair. He drew her out of the smoke and held her forcibly. She panted hard, sobbing a little. The will, gripped tight in her hand, was pressed against her breast and his. "Annette!" he said hoarsely, over and over again. Still holding the will fast, she drew it away from him and opened it with trembling, bleeding fingers, staining the sheet. "It is safe," she said. "It's safe. It's only scorched. You can see the writing quite clear through the brown. Look, Roger, but you mustn't touch it. I can't trust you to touch it. It is safe. Only the bottom of the sheet is burnt, where there wasn't anything written. Look, Dick's name is there, and the doctor's, and the notary's. Only mine is gone." "Oh, Roger. Now my name is gone, the will is just about right, isn't it?" Roger drew in his breath and looked at the blood-smeared, smoke-stained page. "It is all right now," he said in a strangled voice. And then he suddenly fell on his knees and hid his convulsed face in her gown. "You mustn't cry, Roger, and you mustn't kiss the hem of my gown. Indeed you mustn't. It makes me ashamed. Nor my hands, they're quite black. Oh, how my poor Roger cries." End of chapter 42. End of Notwithstanding by Mary Chumley.